watching Channel 4, now the first in a new series of 6 medical documentaries, Kill or Cure. Tonight, the story of Smon.
In 1965, Keiko Yamaguchi was a lively 20-year-old. She enjoyed her work, went skiing at weekends, and had plans to travel round the world. Today, she lives in the countryside outside Tokyo. She is blind and paralyzed from the waist down. Keiko's tragic condition was caused by some tablets she was prescribed for diarrhea. Steve Smith was a fine, healthy baby. But then he began to suffer from chronic diarrhea. He too was given some tablets. The nerves behind his eyes were damaged. Today, at 16, he's only able to see out of the edges of his eyes.
Well, it was hard for me to tell other people about it. They'd ask me why I was looking up, and I'd tell them that it was a drug that I was taking when I was real young, and it had some side effects which weren't printed on the bottle.
Sandra Lawley, living here in Boone, North Carolina, can now manage to walk, but with difficulty. She has partial vision. 8 years ago, she could only walk a few steps and was declared legally blind after taking a course of tablets for diarrhea. Keiko, Steve and Sandra all suffered injury from the same type of drug. You may remember in the 1960s being encouraged to take little brown pills like these called enteroviaform before you went on holiday to avoid getting traveller's diarrhea or non-specific diarrhea. Well, for years it was thought that chloroquinol, the chemical in these pills, just went straight through the body and wasn't absorbed. But gradually, more and more people started to show disastrous side effects, particularly in Japan. It was discovered that chloroquinol could be absorbed through the lining of the stomach, gradually damaging and eventually destroying the connection between the nerve cells. The damage can affect 3 different parts of the body: the nerves in the eyes, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves. Hence its name, subacute myelooptic neuropathy, or SMON. In England, Dr. Leonard McEwen came across these symptoms in the mid-1960s when he was treating a number of patients with enteroviaform for severe allergy.
You start by starting to feel tingling as the nerves get damaged and numbness as you stop being able to feel things. You start to get weak and your muscles start to waste in your limbs. If it goes on, it will gradually produce a creeping paralysis which will become absolutely total. And of course what I haven't said is that in some people it affects the nerves going to the eyes, or coming back from the eyes rather, and you gradually go totally blind.
One of Dr. McEwen's patients describes how she felt.
Well, my legs became very weak. I started to fall fairly frequently. I gradually started to suffer from severe foot drop, so that I was walking like somebody who'd had polio.
Enteroviaform, which is the brand name, belongs to a group of drugs called halogenated hydroxyquinolines. These can be combined chemically in slightly different ways and produce variations like halquinol, brand name Quixilin, diiodohydroxyquin, brand name Diodoquin, and chloroquinol, main brand names Mexiform and enteroviaform. Quixilin, Diodoquin, and enteroviaform are therefore chemically related drugs and identical in the effect they can have on people. By far the biggest seller has been enteroviaform, manufactured by Ciba-Geigy Pharmaceuticals, whose headquarters are in Basel, Switzerland. Enteroviaform came on the market in 1934 and was found to be effective for asymptomatic amoebic infection. But over the next 40 years was to be recommended widely for non-specific diarrhea. Yet, as early as 1935, 2 doctors in Argentina, Dr. Gravitz and Dr. Barros, described serious side effects in an Englishwoman who'd been given high doses of enteroviaform and had developed sensory and motor disturbances of her lower limbs. She dragged her legs and repeatedly fell down. Their findings were reported to Ciba in Argentina. But 40 years later, when Ciba Geigy was taken to court in Japan, they did not acknowledge the existence of these first reports until they were forced to do so by the victim's solicitors. Other reports of damage to the nervous system began to filter into the medical journals. In 1939, studies with animals showed neurotoxicity. Other reports of damage in humans came in 1964 from Doctors Goltz and Ahrens in California, in January 1966 from Doctors Berggren and Hansen in Sweden, also in January 1966 from Doctors Stewart and Etheridge in North Carolina. Yet no warnings about possible neurotoxicity in humans appeared in any of Ciba Geigy's printed information about enteroviaform until 1968, and that was only in certain European countries. Today, enteroviaform and other brands of chloroquinol are available in countries all over the world where they may be sold over the counter with no leaflets or any warnings whatsoever. I bought this packet of enteroviaform in Penang, Malaysia in 1982. It is now banned there, and this is what I got. Just a pack with little brown pills inside, but no leaflet. But how useful are these pills anyway? So I asked Dr. Andrew Herxheimer, who's been interested in the drug for many years, whether enteroviaform actually works.
No, it doesn't work. It is a drug which has some activity against one type of diarrhea, but in order to diagnose that, one has to do laboratory tests, and that is normally never possible.
Do we need enteroviaform?
No, we don't need it at all.
Could enteroviaform, or the chloroquinol in it, actually cause diarrhea?
Yes, well, that was found in the discussion of the Japanese cases and studies that were done then. It was found that chloroquinol itself could actually cause diarrhea.
Why is it then that chloroquinol-based drugs like enteroviaform and mexiform have sold so extensively across the world if you say that they're not really effective?
Well, they date from a time when critical clinical trials were not performed on new drugs, and the evidence for their efficacy wasn't very good, but they just became very popular and very widely used. So they were really turned into a sort of folk remedy.
A folk remedy with disastrous results. A folk remedy that led to the biggest drug tragedy in the world. This is one of the 11,000 victims of SMON in Japan. 700 have died, and many others today lie unable to move or see in the corners of darkened wards. In Japan, a great deal of emphasis is put on problems of the digestion. It could be said that the stomach is the organ of the emotions, as the heart is for us. Consequently, patients were often prescribed long-term courses of enteroviaform. Doctors in Japan also sell the drugs they prescribe, so there was a financial incentive in keeping patients on long-term treatment. By the end of the 1960s, there were so many cases of SMON that it had reached epidemic proportions, and the SMON Research Commission was set up by the Japanese government. It was then that Japan's Professor Tadao Tsubaki first linked the SMON syndrome with chloroquinol, proving that it was dose-related. When we met him, he said that in his opinion, chloroquinol should be banned across the world. SMON attacked the young as well as the old. Ukichi Mita was given chloroquinol at the age of 2. She is now totally blind and only able to crawl. In May 1971, the first legal actions began to be brought in Japan. These eventually involved more than 100 lawyers acting on behalf of 7,000 claimants. One of the teams, led by Mr. Hiroshi Izumi, consisted of 30 lawyers. Etsuro Totsuka and his colleagues, by the end of the litigation, had amassed whole rooms full of documents with a rigorous and complex cross-reference filing system to match. I asked Mr. Totsuka if he'd describe how seriously ill some of his clients were.
Oh yes, I met many patients, and when I saw them, I felt very, very sad. Many of them could not walk and also could not see, blind. And they were very poor. The litigation will be very, very difficult and takes much time. They could not wait so long.
Can you explain what Ciba-Geigy's defense was during the Japanese trials?
Ciba-Geigy denied that small was caused by chloroquinol, and also they said that they had no mistakes.
Was any information not disclosed?
Yes. They did not submit very, very important scientific papers which warned neurotoxicity of chloroquinol in 1935.
What important pieces of evidence really won the case for the plaintiffs?
I think the correspondence between Dr. Hansen and the company in 1962 about the absorption of chloroquinol. This was vital, I think. Dr. Hansen is a Swedish scientist, and he is a pediatrician, but specialized in drug problems. And he found the neurotoxicity in very early stage and reported in 1966 to the Lancet.
We made an investigation in a patient I had with a very rare congenital disorder in which the only treatment at that time was this kind of drugs. And I had found in the literature that these drugs were absorbed in animal experiments. So then we repeated exactly the same experiment in this patient and in some healthy persons. And the result was exactly the same as in the animals. It was absorbed because it was excreted in the urine.
Did you correspond with Geigy, as it was then, about this?
Yes. And I asked them about absorption, toxicity, and so forth. And, well, frankly, they denied everything.
How important was this correspondence later in the trials in Japan?
Well, I think in a way it was crucial.
How?
Well, they denied facts.
What is your opinion of the conduct of Ciba-Geigy during the Japanese trials?
Oh, it's deplorable. I mean, they didn't accept scientific facts.
In 1978, the first district court decision was made. A jubilant spokesman runs out to tell the assembled victims the result. The plaintiffs had won their case. In the end, Ciba-Geigy, the Japanese government, and 2 Japanese companies were made to pay the victims a total so far of 127,637 million yen. That's over £300 million in compensation. Ciba-Geigy in Japan made an apology to the victims. They said, "In view of the fact that medical products manufactured and sold by us have been responsible for the occurrence of this tragedy in Japan, we extend our apologies frankly and without reservation to the plaintiffs and their families."
Ciba-Geigy continued to sell chloroquinol wherever else they could. In 1980, this was the world picture. Chloroquinol was banned in Japan and taken off the market in a number of countries, mainly in the developed world. But wherever else drug controls were less stringent, chloroquinol was still available over the counter. Ciba-Geigy has always attempted to defend the continuing sale of chloroquinol by maintaining that SMON was a syndrome peculiar to Japan and that the drug-induced sufferings there did not justify withdrawing chloroquinol in the rest of the world.
I think there's no doubt that the Japanese epidemic was far greater than anything that occurred anywhere else. But there have been cases in all countries where the drug was used to any extent, And, of course, the animal experiments on these drugs have shown very clearly that they are capable of damaging the nervous system. So to say that this is a purely Japanese problem is nonsense.
At a conference on drug-induced sufferings held in Kyoto, Japan in 1979, cases of hydroxyquinoline damage were reported from more than 25 countries outside Japan. These include North and South America, Europe, Israel, Iran and Australia.
In the UK, during all 7 years of the Japanese trials, enteroviaform was still on sale freely over the counter. It wasn't until 1977 that the Committee on Safety of Medicines restricted it to prescription only. The chairman during those years was Sir Eric Scowen.
In this country, it was only in the form of enteroviaform and was only indicated for the prevention of traveller's diarrhea or the treatment of. Now, there had been something like 10 million dose sequences without us having any indicator of any trouble. But of course, it almost entirely was by people going abroad on holidays for a short time. Then the trouble began with the famous subacute myelooptic neuropathy. We, in fact, went into this in great detail in this country and could find no evidence of anything of that sort happening here.
But John Body's side effects from enteroviaform had been reported to the committee in the late 1960s by Dr. McEwen.
Well, after some weeks, there was a distinct loss of feeling, first in one hand, then in the other, and later still in my feet and in the lower part of my legs.
When you say loss of feeling?
It's a partial numbness. Not a complete loss of feeling, but it was quite distinct.
There's no question that this can happen in English people as well. The reason that my patients didn't get worse trouble was that we recognized the problem so quickly, and all the patients were warned. I didn't start my experiments with enteroviaform until I had asked CBER if it was reasonable to give people enteroviaform for 3 months on the stretch while I did my experiments on their asthma. And they had responded with a thick wad of papers, a lot of them original published articles, which said that it was safe.
What year was CBER reassuring you about the drug?
That was either the end of 1964 or the beginning of 1965.
How important did you think your findings were in terms of the side effects?
Well, obviously I thought they were very important because this was a drug which was on sale over chemists' counters with instructions on the packet to take it for as long as you liked while you were away on holiday, just in case you got trouble in your bowel. And I wrote to the predecessor of the Medicines Commission. It was then called the Committee of Safety of Medicines. And they got in touch with me. They got in touch with CBER. I got a message from CBER to say that I had contacted the Medicines Commission and that they had to make what they called the appropriate noises back, and would I help them? And I said, well, I'm terribly sorry, but I really have seen these things. There's no question about it.
We, in fact, have a complete series of the reports from 64 to 76. They add up to very little, and therefore, what evidence had I got to change it?
You say no evidence of any harm. I have been told by the department here in the past that there were around 56 reports since 1963 of adverse side effects. Now, granted, some of those could be very light, but were you not aware of the several quite severe side effects reported by Dr. McEwen in the 1966 and 67?
They were not on our adverse reactions list. No, that's right. I thought that was the answer.
What was the answer?
They could not be substantiated.
Who tried to substantiate them?
The committee. CSD in those days.
So you didn't put any value on his report?
No. No value, put no value is wrong. They needed investigation.
Were they investigated?
Yes.
And your conclusion was?
That we could not be satisfied that they were entirely due to the enteroviroform.
Enteroviroform's indications for dosage were restricted in 1973, and finally, in 1977, Sir Eric's committee did restrict enteroviroform to prescription only. But there were still plenty of markets in other parts of the world. How does Dr. McEwen feel now about Ciba-Geigy's reaction to his very early warnings about enteroviroform?
I think they behaved abominably. I think what was going on was quite immoral, because in England they had been forced to change the wording on the packets. They knew quite clearly that there was definite evidence that enteroviroform was causing neurological trouble in England, and outside England they were still selling the stuff over the counter as much as possible. Wicked.
But enteroviroform was not the only hydroxyquinoline that was being sold. There were others like quixoline, containing halquinol, another member of the halogenated hydroxyquinoline group.
Jane Seymour in Le Jardin de Max Factor.
Le Jardin.
They say romance is back in style. I say it never went out.
Le Jardin.
Le Jardin says it too. It says it subtly. It says it softly. Just like me.
Le Jardin de Max Factor. The incurably romantic fragrance.
It's Allied Curtains Price Crash on Saturday, May Day, Monday and Tuesday. Ready-made, ready-to-hang curtains at a third off list prices. And fabric by the yard at 25 to 50% off. Like beautiful velvet, just £3.85 a yard. Saturday, May Day, Monday and Tuesday. Only at Allied Carpets, Derby Road, Watford.
Queensway's 14-day half-price sale extended to the bank holiday. Half-price offers in all departments. Queensway sale, open all bank holiday.
The first case of personal drug injury ever to come to the High Court in Britain was brought in 1981 by Mrs. Sandra Lawley, an American citizen. In 1975, Mrs. Lawley was living in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Her husband bought her some quixoline tablets over the counter for diarrhea. The tablets were manufactured in Britain by E.R. Squibb & Sons Limited. There were no warnings of serious side effects on the leaflet. Mrs. Lawley then noticed a tingling and numbness in her feet, and her sight began to go. She became so ill that she had to be flown to the American Air Force Hospital in Wiesbaden, Germany. There she was diagnosed as suffering from SMON. It took 5 years for Mrs. Lawley's case against E.R. Squibb & Sons to come to court. In their defense, Squibb maintained that they knew of no other case of serious neurological damage from quixoline, and that Mrs. Lawley's damage was from drinking locally brewed alcohol in Jeddah. Sandra Lawley received legal aid in Britain, and her case was eventually heard in the High Court in February 1981. After 4.5 days in court, E.R. Squibb and Mrs. Lawley agreed to settle the case out of court. Mrs. Lawley would like to have told us her own story, but the terms of her settlement with Squibb did not allow her to do so. It is precisely this kind of situation that led us to look further into the whole problem of drug injury and the law. At present, in the UK, it is virtually impossible for an ordinary individual to take a case of drug injury to court, because the victim has to try to prove negligence on the part of the drug company. Mrs. Lawley, after 6 years of legal struggle and with the help of legal aid, finally did get her case to court. Because a settlement was then made out of court, no judgment was made, and the conditions of secrecy within the settlement have meant that her own personal story stays under wraps. One of Mrs. Lawley's advisors in the case was Dr. Ola Hansen. I asked him if he was convinced that her damage was from halquinol and that it was consistent with the SMON syndrome.
Yes. because, first of all, her symptoms and signs are exactly the same as described for clyoquinol. She took a drug which belongs to exactly the same chemical group. And finally, there is no other good reason to explain her disorder.
It is believed that the settlement with Mrs. Lawley was in the order of £55,000. Why did Dr. Hansen think Squibb decided to settle after only a few days in court?
There were animal experiments which were not revealed to the drug authorities.
When, soon after the settlement, Oliver Gilley of the Sunday Times asked Squibb to explain why the blinding of some animals after being given halquinol had not been reported to the Committee on Safety of Drugs, Squibb replied in telex form saying, "We regarded the material on calves and cattle as both limited and inconclusive." I asked Dr. Hansen if any documents had not been disclosed.
Letters from British doctor, Dr. Holty, with Squibb. Those letters were not revealed to the court.
This letter was written in 1975 by Dr. Gunther Holty, consultant dermatologist at the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle. It describes a very considerable degree of optic atrophy, or eye damage, in a young patient. She had been given quixoline as a baby for her very serious condition called acrodermatitis enteropathica. Squibb's medical director replied to Dr. Holty on the 30th of September 1975, saying, "Thank you for your very informative letter regarding the possible optic atrophy following quixoline. I have shown this letter to the technical department and they will add this to our files." Yet, when Oliver Gilley asked them why this letter had not been disclosed before Mrs. Lawley's court case, they said, "Dr. Holty's correspondence unfortunately escaped Squibb's extensive pre-trial searches for documents." What action did Dr. Holty take when he realized that his patient was showing side effects?
Yeah. At that stage, of course, I realized immediately that it had to be quixoline, which was the responsible agent for this girl's impaired vision, and I sent her to an ophthalmologist who I thought was particularly experienced in detecting drug-induced eye damage. And he sent me a detailed report which really confirmed that this is the type of eye damage which can be due to drugs. There's never an absolute in medicine. On balance of probabilities, this was drug-induced. And in view of this, I felt it my duty to report this to the assessor of the Committee on the Safety of Medicine. And I also notified within a week or two the Director for Medical Affairs of Squibb that I had done so.
Your correspondence with Squibb wasn't disclosed before Mrs. Lawley's case came to court, and it wasn't mentioned in court. How do you feel about that?
Well, there's either something drastically wrong with Squibb's filing system, because the Director for Medical Affairs, who confirmed and acknowledged the receipt of my letter, said, "This letter will be filed with our technical branch." Then clearly, this file should have risen to the top of the Squibb filing empire, in my humble opinion.
At this point in the programme, we'd like to have interviewed the chairman of ER Squibb & Sons Limited in Britain, Mr. George Snell. These are their headquarters in Hounslow, just outside London. We'd like to have asked Mr. Snell directly why his company didn't disclose the information about the blinding of 2 calves and 2 cattle after being given halquinol to the Committee on the Safety of Drugs, and why the correspondence from Dr. Holty wasn't disclosed before Mrs. Lawley's case came to court. Mr. Snell declined our invitation to appear on this programme.
Squibb no longer manufacture halquinol in the UK. When Squibb settled with Mrs. Lawley, they did not admit liability. She told me how she feels about the way Squibb fought the case.
And I think it's a psychological warfare. They wear you down, or try to. And about the only thing the best way to handle, I think, is just to stay madder than heck the whole time. It keeps you going.
Living in the United States in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, is someone else who had to learn to live without full sight. Steve Smith is now 16. When he was 4 years old, he suffered from an acute form of diarrhea called colitis. He was put on a course of diodoquin. Diodoquin contains diiodohydroxyquin and is another halogenated hydroxyquinoline. The tablets were manufactured by the American company G.D. Searle & Company. I asked his mother, Mrs. Andrea Pike, how she first noticed that Steve's sight was being affected.
One day I was sitting there rocking and he was talking to me, and I thought he was looking at a picture above my head. And I said, "Look at me when you talk to me." And his eyes are up this way, and he said, "I am looking at you." And I said, "No, you're looking at the picture up there."
Steve was suffering from optic atrophy after taking diodoquin.
His case has been documented in several medical journals.
Mrs. Pike sued G.D. Searle & Company on Steve's behalf on the grounds that at the time of prescribing diodoquin to Steve, Searle's literature had informed people that large doses have been administered over prolonged periods without toxic symptoms.
Searle never admitted liability.
Finally, 2.5 years later, a financial settlement was made by Searle, out of court. In 1975, Searle no longer sold diodoquin on the US market. Steve has since learnt to cope remarkably well with his limited peripheral vision and uses a video screen that enlarges print to help him read. I asked him what he could and couldn't do.
There's a whole list of them that I can do. I can ride a bike, play ball, whatever, you know, just like anybody else. And to watch me, you could never tell that there was anything wrong. But I can't get my license. That's the big one right there. I can't never drive. That throws a big knot in going on dates.
How has Steve's limited eyesight affected him? As a mother watching Steve grow up, what were the main problems?
The hurt when other kids would make fun of it. And seeing him have a hard time having to sit within inches of a big TV screen. But mostly the hurt from other kids.
Someone else who suffered as a child is Lionel Lennon, now living in Longwarry, Australia. He was only 4 years old when he was given enteroviaform for recurrent diarrhea. Today, he suffers severe impairment of both eyes and is described as substantially blind. He is suing Ciba-Geigy Australia Limited for negligence.
After 48 years of reports from all over the world stating that hydroxyquinolines are neurotoxic, after definitive proof that they have caused SMON, and after reports from leading pharmacologists and physicians who say we don't need them for the treatment of non-specific diarrhea and that they're not effective in this area anyway, we are left with this. That Ciba-Geigy, the main manufacturer of clyoquinol, will still be selling it extensively over the next 3 to 5 years. At this point in the programme, we would like to have interviewed a representative from Ciba-Geigy. These are their British headquarters, but they too declined our invitation to appear on this programme. Instead, they sent us this paper released in October 1982, requesting and then insisting that we read it in full. We have timed it, and it took nearly 6 minutes to read in full, so we decided to pick out the highlights. Any of you who'd like the full text can contact Ciba-Geigy's Public Relations Department here in Horsham. The paper says that Ciba-Geigy aims at a close cooperation with the Diarrheal Disease Control Programme of the World Health Organization. This will involve information and education about essential preventive measures and about treatment of diarrhea through oral rehydration, proper nutrition and drug therapy. Oral rehydration, I should explain, means providing simple and safe solutions of water, salt and sugar to patients who've lost too much fluid. The paper then mentions a future-oriented clyoquinol policy. That, they say, means a gradual phasing out of chloroquinol over the next 3 to 5 years because it is, and I quote, an old drug. This paper has one remarkable omission. Nowhere does it mention that chloroquinol is neurotoxic.
I think this decision of Ciba-Geigy's to phase out the drug over such an extended period probably has something to do with their unwillingness to admit that there's anything wrong with the drug. If they stopped selling it tomorrow, then perhaps their legal position would be weakened. People could say they've withdrawn the drug and therefore they're admitting that it's not a very good drug.
I think it's dreadful because they apologized in the court to the patients, and also they promised to try their best to get rid of drug sufferings, but they are continuing to sell this. I think I cannot understand why they, such highly educated and also decent people, can do this.
Well, it's the same here. It's deplorable and absolutely unacceptable. I mean, as finally they took this decision, then they should stop the drug immediately. It's many, many years too late, and to continue is just horrible. And even more, after they have taken this decision, they are now continuing trials in human beings in the third world with this drug.
But Ciba-Geigy isn't the only company still selling hydroxyquinolines. Do people who've had close experience of these drugs feel that this type of drug should still be on sale?
No, I definitely don't think it should, because people will take it feeling that it's quite harmless, something like aspirin, not realising the serious side effects that it can have.
The people who's making them should be shot. That's bluntly, you know. It makes me mad to just think about that, because it affected me, and just to think it's hurting a lot of others too.
It angers me, and it scares me, because, you know, I'd do anything to keep what's happened to Stephen from happening to another child. And because I'm tender-hearted, and I don't like to see kids hurt. I like to see them suffer.
In the third world, diarrhea is a serious, life-threatening problem for children, so fluid supplements and some drugs are vital, but not drugs that don't work and can cause damage. At this very moment in India, Africa or Latin America, a mother with a baby who has diarrhea could be giving her child an adult dose of hydroxyquinolines. This child could be damaged, and no one will ever know why.